Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to brand new social Confoes. I'm Shaluk, today, as usual, hosted by Shaluk and Diego. Diego, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I was just telling you I had a surprise visit in my kitchen today. Unfortunately, I didn't get to,
An iguana.
consume consume it, but it was huge. Yeah,
Well, he still
uh,
managed to find his way out, which was either disappointing or relieving, depending on what your take is.
I think he was as shocked as I was when I saw it, so he escaped. But speaking of escaping and talking about getting shocked or encountering difficult situations. A topic that's really interesting and maybe very relevant nowadays, especially, is the topic surrounding brain drain, people migrating from one location to another, and particularly skilled people migrating from one location to another for a better life, whereas the country or location they're leaving is basically being left with, you know, uh, the less skilled people. And that kind of has different impacts, different consequences. So we thought it would be interesting to explore that topic a bit today on, is it real? Because you hear this topic a lot, but is it real? What is brain drain? Is it only something that affects poor countries, developing countries, or advanced countries even? So who does it affect, and how can you cope with brain drain? Is it something you do for yourself? Is it bad? Is it good? So let's dig into it. Shanluk, how
Okay,
do you?
right off the bat, we got some comments in saying like, "Hey, 60% of the people I know are already fleeing the country." So the first thing I want to talk about is defining brain drain, which you kind of already did,
Yeah.
but
So
it's often
so
it's often that we connect brain drain to developing countries. But is that fair though? That's the first question you have to ask. Is it fair to just generalize and think that the brain drain is something that only happens in developing countries? Because I feel it's not the case.
likewise, so if we look at the definition, it's basically just highly skilled or educated individuals going from one country to another in pursuit of a better opportunity, a better living condition. So if you're going from a rich country where maybe you've reached your career cap, or that opportunity isn't there, and you leave that to another country and you have better opportunities, that's also a form of brain drain. But because it has a bigger impact, I think, on developing countries compared to the more advanced developed countries, that the spotlight is being put on
But
that
is that the
much more.
case? Is that the case?
Is it the case that it's only
Because this
affecting
is
developing
like this
countries? I
is
think it's developing all a
yeah.
lot of countries.
Okay, let's first you kind of describe what a brain drain is. Then the second question is how does it come about? Like what triggers a brain drain? Because in my personal experience, brain drains are triggered events. It's not automatically. It's something that slowly can go about, but when we talk about a brain drain, it's often like on a
So
massive
in
scale, on a big
yeah,
scale.
so it's basically a mass exodus of people
Yes.
leaving, right?
Yes.
Uh,
So that's and then we start thinking like what's a major reason why a brain drain occurs? A war, for instance. Like war is kind of the biggest brain drain uh, reason for brain drain. Like for instance, when would you move to another country? When you're no longer safe, right? So
Yeah, safety and
even
security is a big
yeah, so
factor.
even people who don't want to migrate in those situations migrate in those situations because of fear for their life. So a war
But
would definitely be number one.
even though you consider that a trigger event a cause,
Yeah.
it is more for safety than for better of. Well, yeah, you could categorize
Yeah.
it that. Don't-
So it's in that sense, it's not about like, hey, I'm the it's not their, it's less their decision, if I may say it like that. You're really being forced
Yes.
out.
So I would put it more in the direction of, you're opting in for moving out. It's not a forced event like a war or a pandemic or what you might call it. There are these trigger events that maybe in some regions, some industries are booming, like we have now with the oil stuff here. So there are Caribbean countries brain draining on each other,
And
in that sense.
I'm really
So that's
wondering
how
the
I
war.
wanna
I find the
how,
war
how I wanna
interesting.
label it.
Yeah, I find the war interesting because from a brain drain perspective, it's really curious. It's kind of this psychological experiment whether or not actually smart and skilled people would move back to their country, like saying, hey, there's a war going on, my country's at war, so my country needs me, should I, and I should go. Or to say like, hey, I think the smart thing to do right now is kind of flee this country because our country is at war and it's getting dangerous. So it's kind of that, but that's the first major event that people would identify. The second one would be a revolution, which is really interesting because again, with a revolution, you would think like if it's on a positive side, that a revolution would probably trigger people to be like, hey, we're revolting, we're going to build a better nation, so we want better skilled labor in. But in reality, often the opposite happens.
Yeah,
In
because
reality, it's often,
when you have
go ahead.
revolutions, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And people often look at the least risky option. They want to have some security, some safety. So after a revolution or even during the revolution, that's the most uncertain period. You don't know what's going to happen. Even if they promise something better, you don't know. So if you have an option to have a more secured lifestyle or life in another country, you'll opt in for that option. Maybe you want to return after a few years when things stabilize, but you want to remove yourself from danger, from the risks. And I think that's the big factor there if it comes to safety.
Then the other one, which is also interesting, which ties into that, is the collapse of a current regime. That could also trigger a major brain drain, the collapse of a
See,
certain regime.
I understand where you're coming from, but I don't want to, how do you say this, have this discussion in a certain direction of, very doom and gloomy on a very political or governmental
But that's the
event.
interesting thing about it.
So
So
is
okay,
it
let's call it
usually
governmental reform. Let's
is
or
it
societal
usually
reform.
related to a governmental political reform?
Yes, usually it is. So I mean, you could go very abstract. Like you could even have a brain drain based on, let's just say racism, for instance. If you look at apartheid in South Africa, that actually had a very big impact on the brain drain of South Africa as well. At some point, of course, not uh,
Yeah.
all over like during the whole history that apartheid was there, but probably during apartheid, in some cases have been mentioned of there being, due to that racial injustice and imbalance, people saying, skilled labor saying like, hey, I can go to another country where I'm actually more respected for my skilled labor compared to staying here. And that would be, I think we might even see more of that, not necessarily racial injustice, but a social injustice in general, or even social hysteria leading for people to say like, hey, you know what, gonna live in a different state or a different country just to be away from that environment, which I feel like doesn't work for me. And the reason why this is such an interesting topic is also because there's more information than ever. So there's also more opportunities than ever. And the reason why it's important to still consider the political aspect is the geopolitics and the need for a visa for especially developing countries to make that decision, because a brain drain is only possible to a
Yeah, if you can
country
actually move. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
allows you to get in. And then we're just talking about, right now we're talking about national brain drain, right? Like from one country to another one.
Yeah, that's usually how it's categorized. On a local level, basically, when people go from the districts, from the outskirts to the
Yeah,
capital city or to major cities, that's also a form of brain drain and centralization.
yeah,
But because you concentrate it in a smaller scale, because it's a better life in the capital city, for example, it's also a form
yeah,
of brain drain. But usually, in the broader context, it's on a national level from one country to another country, basically contributing to the workforce and economy there, and removing the skill that you would have to contribute to your own
yeah,
country.
yeah. Okay. Now we kind of define it now, also given like a little bit of a context and in what way we see it. Would you consider brain drain a real thing? Yes or no?
Yes, but very, I'm going to say this, very nuanced. And this basically being for the reasons you mentioned or the examples you mentioned, basically the biggest factor is safety, right? Safety and predictability. So that's the one thing that's plays a major role. And if you don't have that safety net, and there's a lot of uncertainty in you where you are, and people start slowly leaving, and you see your peers, the highly skilled peers especially, start moving, people will start looking for those opportunities as well. So in that sense, yes, brain drain is, yeah, it's real. Let's
It's
just put it like that.
interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned uncertainty and then moving to an even more uncertain situation, because you can look at it from a certainty perspective, but it's actually more
Well,
uncertain situation. For me, I
yeah,
feel
so
if you have a brain
I,
drain, people go out of their comfort zone to go in from something they know to something that they don't know even.
there is, let's say, there's a certainty in the uncertainty they have locally, whereas there is a opportunity, an uncertain opportunity, a uncertain better opportunity to the location they're going. So it's a weight of, what's the potential upside compared to the potential downside. So I that's how I view it, basically, especially when you have people in highly skilled jobs, engineers, um, jobs that you can do for from anywhere, medical workers. If they see they can make, 5 10 times the amount they make here, or they can advance their career and get better skills, they can get the education, then they would opt in to leave, compared to locally, because either you're limited locally to the opportunities that you have, or there is more, risk, even though you know the situation locally better.
Okay, but now playing devil's advocate, isn't it okay? The brain drain itself is very real because it happens, but with the current developments technologically, the current developments economically, wouldn't it make more sense now to stay in certain environments if you can replicate the positive aspects from the other environment that you are gonna move to? If you could replicate it
So how
locally.
will you replicate it? Because some factors are out of your control. So let's take Suriname, for example, where because we have a lot of people we know that have left the countries, moved to the Netherlands or states, whatever, because of other opportunities, even to our neighboring countries, Guyana, because there the oil industry is already attracting a lot of expats to work there, and they're offering better salaries than you could get for the same job locally, and that's just basic fact. And if you can replicate that here, we don't have it here yet. So who is supposed to replicate that, and are you willing to wait and take on that risk to shape that environment? So I think that's a personal choice that people have to make.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it very clearly that it's in the end it's an often an uh, economic situation. Like if we look at the current brain drain that's going on, it has a lot to do with inflation.
Yeah,
Like inflation
once the
is,
security and uncertainty
yeah.
of the threat of war or something is removed, then the next
Mhm.
thing to look
It's
at,
the
and
economic
mostly, yeah, it's the
is
economic
the
factor.
is the economic factor. So the first is security, and the second one is financial benefits. So now it's very financial beneficiary actually to move to another country out of Suriname, for instance, because just for the salaries alone. So if you're like, especially if you don't have commitments as family members that you need to take care of, but even with that, because there is this buyback where when you go abroad and
Yeah,
you
the
actually
remittance industry,
the
basically.
remittance industry is already pretty large, often in Suriname, like in many other developing countries. So let's take to that into consideration. Yes, there is a remittance industry of people, the brain drain going on, and then people sending money back to their country of origin. But if you look at the opportunities that are available in other countries at the moment, and that's also largely due to the situation there, they're just certain jobs that in Western societies, Westerners no longer want to do. So there are
Yeah,
certain skilled labor jobs, which are often considered a little bit low skilled labor jobs that become available, which for people coming out of an industry or a society where you earn much less than that are actually like huge opportunities. It's kind of like the
exactly.
migrant culture, right? So if you look at from that perspective, yes, it would make total sense. But if you look at from a perspective in an industry where um, you already kind of have high skilled labor and you don't physically have to be present, there are some interesting jobs that are already available in developing countries for Western companies. The only thing you have to do is be able to guarantee that the level of service in those countries is similar or even better than in the Western countries. And once you're able to establish that, there's actually a very big win win because the rates are a little bit lower compared to the Western market, but you get the same quality. And in the Western market, nobody's willing to do the work anymore.
For sure, definitely with the rise of remote work, that has become an option for many people. But oftentimes, for the security, it's also the lifestyle or the social benefits that you have in set countries where you migrate to, that people look into, like, the social system, the social care there. Even though some things are much cheaper here, they kind of prefer something more predictable or being taken care of. So that's another factor to take into account. But for sure, for many, once you can get those connections of doing a job remotely, then yeah, that's a huge opportunity. It's basically a win because you get that X amount of income from somewhere in Europe, and you live in a country in the Caribbean. That's a huge win, and you could basically live better than average if you're smart about it. The other
Well,
thing is maybe people want to grow uh, in their career, in their education, in their skill level. Some positions require you to be physically there, and maybe the traveling back and forth might be too expensive. So you need to outweigh that. Is it beneficial to completely move, or can I just stay far away? And for some people, that's heaven. You just in your own little base, and you don't need to worry about anything else. But for others that are very driven or need people or need that office environment or need to move around, then it would make more sense for them to move. And also being exposed to or living in that environment, the environmental effects also play a role there, how you're gonna live. So that's the other factor, I would say.
I think I fully agree with you. And of course, the interesting thing is that many Western people from Western societies have actually benefited from moving remote and being able to get their audience. But indeed, starting off in the Western society with already having those clients and then moving
Yeah. So
towards,
So
yeah,
if you look at the more advanced economies, people who've established that working remote or have a fixed clientele and they don't need to be physically present, they kind of migrate to lower cost countries. So I think Spain and Portugal in Europe is a popular destination for people to move out of, away from Germany.
Greece is
Yeah,
very popular as well,
because it's cheaper to live there and they can still do the same work, and travel is relatively easy. So
and it's
that's
much
one
better
option.
weather.
True. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's less gloomy, cold and gloomy. So that's the other factor, or at least another factor to take into consideration. And when we mentioned brain drain in the beginning, it's not just the developing countries, but there is a certain degree of brain drain from the developed
Okay.
countries as well. But
So,
the ratio and the value impact that it has on the countries, that's the interesting thing to look at.
but then let's go to the value impact, because hear me out. Just like there's a lot of high skilled labor moving from developing countries to Western countries or developed countries, right? There's also a lot of high skilled labor moving from Western countries to developing countries,
Yes.
right? So, what's the impact that that has on the Western countries as well? You also get weakened leadership. You also get less skilled people. And of course, the
Uh,
percentage is going to play a certain role.
what was that on leadership? I misheard you, or I didn't clearly hear you there.
No, so even if you have like skilled laborers, but also local leaders deciding, hey, it's better to go live in Southeast Asia and enjoy my life there,
Yeah.
with them moving away, not taking in those leadership positions that they would usually take in to build a better nation or a better country. That's also a pretty big impact as well. And I think there's also something very interesting which doesn't get talked about, and that's also the generational pull of people no longer feeling the necessity that it's their job to save a certain nation or to save the government or to save anything for that matter, saying like, hey, first of all, I'm pretty much aware that I'm not bigger than I think I am. And even though people want to put me in a box of that person, the savior, I know that I'm only a savior to a certain extent, and I should be humble about my skill set and not think that because I have a certain skill set that is a little bit better than others, that I'm actually a savior and I will be able to save the world. So that plays into account. Second thing that plays to account is also saying like, hey, listen, I don't like the office politics. So even though I would be very capable of helping this company out. There's too many office politics involved that don't allow me to do the proper work. So, you know what? I don't have to do it and I'll do something else. So, even though that on a scale you would say, like, yeah, that's pretty small, it's still often more than you think and having also an impact on the environments of structures and societies where we feel like, oh, they've got their structure figured out, they're struggling as well.
Okay, so on the point of leadership, I can see where you're coming from. Say someone with leadership skills, a leadership position, moving to a country in Southeast Asia, developing country. Basically, they're not going to contribute in the same way that they would, that a local person, a highly skilled local person would, taking certain leadership positions, because they want to escape from that. Whereas the people in that have the skills and want to go leadership positions, they're kind of being held back by the system. And if you can go to a country with a better system, taking better care of you, they can offer their services there.
Well,
Look at
it doesn't
the
even have to be take better care of you. It's just like you're saying, like, I'm out. I
yeah,
no longer believe that this societal structure benefits anyone.
exactly. But then they don't contribute that value in the developing country they move to. If they move from a rich country or an advanced economy to a developing country, they don't necessarily contribute in leadership. They basically contribute economically to a certain degree, but to a lesser extent, because they can live a
Also
more lavish
leadership,
life.
because they show locals that it's possible to set up a certain business. That
Like
should be
what?
taken into consideration, right? Like often
Yeah,
in those cases, they go to, like, for instance, they go to Southeast Asia and they start running a business a certain way, and the locals look at that business, even become a part of it, work there, and figure out, like, hey, this is an actual business model that would be interesting for us. Of course, there's always a missing ingredient, which is the link to the other country. But aside from that, basically they can provide a leadership expertise and or even more
they.
uh
I
but
agree, but how often does it happen? Do you have some examples for
yeah,
us
I'm no, I'm really, the
locally?
reason I'm bringing it up is to see whether or not this is actually a way to counter the brain drain, actually, by saying, like, hey, if a country has a brain drain one way, you could get a brain gain the other way. The only thing is you have to have policy in place for that.
I was about to mention, because go if you look at the traffic from, developing to advanced economy, usually the more advanced developed economies have policies to limit a certain amount of skilled migrant workers, so they can basically open up or close the faucet, the drain on how many people are allowed to do that. Whereas the other way around, there's no policies that say, oh, if you come and live here, you should do a certain amount of added value, have a certain amount of added value to the country. So that's what you don't have. So yes, I do agree that the policies are important, and that's the missing ingredient, I'd say, if you look at the direction of the brain drain traffic.
Okay, and another thing, because you're calling me out on statistics, which I don't have, but maybe you have the statistics on the remittance economy from people who've over the past 40 years moved to another country and are actually still supporting the country where they came from. Because I
I
feel that's a very big part as well.
I don't have the statistics necessarily, but I do remember, if you think about our conversation with, who was it again? Boris on El Salvador. And basically, he mentioned that the remittance industry is the biggest income source for the country, because they have so many workers in the US that, I think, I'm just guessing here, but look back in that episode, but it was more than 50% of the economy is thanks to remittances that come in to the country from skilled workers going outside. So yeah, it is a big industry, but then you get the question, right. basically the skilled workers are outside. So that's the problem there. It's not about the money flowing in, it's about the skills going
Okay.
away. And then you
Okay.
can develop the country less local.
If you look at it from that perspective, what would be your ideal situation?
It's difficult. Like, what would be the ideal situation? Well, what am I?
So,
Am I the, yeah,
so
who?
you could say like you could build a system where the remittance kind of becomes part of the national policy.
But
As
how
weird
are
as
you
it
gonna
may,
do that?
as weird as
Because
it may
it's,
sound.
yeah,
Yeah.
because you're going into people's private businesses basically, and
Yeah, you
how are
are.
you gonna how are
No,
you
no,
gonna
no.
regulate it?
I'm
So that's the issue that
yes.
you get there.
And do you want to regulate it? That's the second
Exactly.
question. Okay. Um, if you look at different examples of how brain drains were battled, you get to situations like India, uh, where they're like, okay, we're going to invest in higher education. We're going to try to have as many innovation hubs options as
Yeah. So
well. We're
that's
going to focus
that you
on,
attract. Yeah.
yes, we're going to focus on more local production. We're going to highly value local production. Then you have the Chinese method, which is and that's really um, attracting overseas talent to come back to China, which is a lot more difficult than it sounds.
Can you explain the
And
China one? I have heard about it, but
okay, I don't know a very big deal about it, but in most cases, it's like getting support to live abroad, and in for that support to live abroad, you kind of pay back to the government. But it's a very leftist communist kind of structure.
so
Um,
basically, the higher skilled Chinese individuals get support from the government to study abroad or work abroad, but they have a contractual obligation to get
yes,
something.
which is not weird because if you go through I'm not sure if it's the UNDP or one of the other scholarships in Japan, which I almost applied for, you get like a year of tuition for free, like everything paid. I think it's somewhere in the line of $35,000, which you get as a full grant to study in Japan. But you have to return to your country of origin to work and help build society there.
That's usually
So
most
it's
scholarships.
usually the
That's
case. So it's
yeah,
not weird
that's
for a country
usually
to ask it. The
yeah,
most, yeah,
but on that
yeah,
point, that's usually a policy to help other countries. Like New Zealand had the same thing,
okay,
but the reality is what a lot of people do, and maybe this is reading between the lines, but also what I've heard and been told is they attract the people from abroad through these government programs,
yeah,
whereas you're contractually obliged to do X amount of years in your own country, contribute to that development and local economy. But in this way, because they get people from overseas to their country, they show them that it's better there, there's better system, basically there's better education, there's a better standard of life. So it becomes, once they've done their time, basically not talking like in prison, once they've done their time back in their country, they make it easier because the connections are already there to
yeah,
for them to come back. So that's how
yeah,
they get you. They show you the good stuff, is basically the carrot, and then you go back for a little while, you get a stick, and then they get you back and they know they've educated you, they know what they've invested in you, and then you contribute after a few years back to their country. So that's
yeah.
the strategy behind that, how I see it,
Of
and
course, of course.
how I've heard it.
Um, there are some other interesting ones. I'm trying to you caught me off guard there because there was something that you mentioned that I wanted to jump into for sure. I think the most not extreme but interesting take I saw was the Cuban one, where in Cuba they actually say you're an artist, say you're a skilled musician, you're a pianist, they will pay your piano for you, the state. They will pay
Hmm.
everything for you as long as you're studying. Basically, your instrument, everything, you pay, and then when you start performing internationally, you have to pay back to the state.
Right.
And that's where the difficult part comes in, where talents and skilled labor that is like, hey, wait, okay, on one hand, that was nice. On the other hand, I'm seeing where I'm living now and my opportunities, and they don't go back. So they kind
S-
of escape and become kind of fugitives in in their own country. So that's interesting as well. That it's those systems aren't really guaranteeing that people buy into the
Yeah, because
collectivist mindset.
it's a risk, right? It's a risk that the government takes. They basically invest in you as a potential performer, returner. So the
Yes,
risk
but yeah,
reward ratio,
yeah, the risk
it's
rewards
kind of
ratio is also there
skewed.
because they do invest in that side, but they don't invest in other sides that citizens might find important or relevant in this day and age. And that's where it
S-
becomes really difficult.
Like what other things, for example, in your Cuban example?
Well, I mean, there's certain ways of life, and if you have seen like a different kind of cultures outside of Cuba compared to the Cuban culture, and if you don't fully buy in to the nationalist culture of Cuba, you might be thrown away from ever going back,
Oh
because
yeah, for
that's the
sure,
lifestyle you don't want to live anymore. But it's a lifestyle choice.
for
Like
sure,
there's certain things that are different in Cuba than the rest of the world, and there are people who visit the rest of the world and like, hey, I'm not going to go back there. And those cases can be whether or not they had actual support from the government. In some cases, those are people that never had any support, have a much better lifestyle somewhere else and decide not to go back. But in some cases, there are also people that actually had good support from the government, but decided like, okay, but there's other things that I value more than
yeah.
the support that I'm getting. And that makes it really difficult. And that's the reason why I'm so, um, I'm, how can I say that? I'm not confused, but conflicted in the sense that when I was studying in Europe, there was a lot around globalization, but it was only globalization from a developmental perspective and not globalization taking into all considerations into account. And one of the biggest one that it doesn't take into account in theory is the practical approach to political geography,
Hmm. That's a fair
right?
point because the ability to move freely across borders is very skewed to uh, the advanced economies have a huge advantage compared to the developing
Well,
countries.
just the
They,
passport on its
yeah,
own, an
yeah,
American
just getting a
passport
passport.
or a Dutch passport or an Australian or a British passport gets you in so many more countries than a Surinamese passport, for instance.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's in theory it's all beautiful that we're moving towards globalization, and we are actually moving towards globalization, but especially from an influence perspective. Like it doesn't
right.
matter anymore, like from which country you are, but if you can influence me and I'm open to it, you will be able to influence me and you will be able to teach me things from your culture, which I can benefit from. So from that perspective, completely. But then from the geopolitical perspective, where there's certain borders that you just cannot cross if you don't have a certain passport, or there's certain opportunities that you won't be able to get because of the fear, and that fear is only there because of already dozens or sometimes millions of people have already benefited from crossing that uh, line, that geographical line, making it harder for others to do it as well.
Yeah,
And
so
that's,
it's
yeah,
basically what happens to for us here. That's why a lot of people go to the Netherlands either through the study route or the work route,
yeah,
and they try to get the Dutch citizenship, the Dutch passport,
yeah,
because it after those years that you've put into it, it allows you the ability to move across those borders more freely. And oftentimes, what you see is then they return back after having, gotten that experience, that
Do
access,
they return
and
back though? I think that's the biggest question on the brain drain.
I know of a few, at least from my generation, that either have already made a step or are thinking about it. But I also know a lot who just, in the past 3, 4 years left. And from some friends, I know that they're talking about, okay, in a few years, they want to come back because they don't want that that high-paced lifestyle there compared to what they had here. But they have established a certain amount of connections there, a certain amount of insurance there, and now they can take that back here to basically have a freer lifestyle.
So, from that perspective, has the brain drain that is taking place over the past decade changed compared to the brain drain that we had in the 90s?
Uh, I was barely born in the 90s, so I've heard stories about the 80s and into the 90s because you had the different revolutions and that exodus that happened. That was one trigger. So now I think it's different. It's more a economic like factor that's driving a lot of it. But I think it's also a generational ebb and flow that you have of certain groups of people that go and come. So
So,
you
from
spoke
that
about the different.
perspective, a brain drain isn't necessarily a bad thing for a country.
No, I don't think so. If they go out and for some people they're gonna stay. You can't put all people in one basket, but if they see that they have different advantages or liberties in their home country, they might return. Or if conditions stabilize, they might return after they've been able to observe. But then you should have the policies in place that allows them to, you know, help add value once they get back. So,
Okay.
yeah,
But then,
I'll let you make your point, and then
no, but
I
then
want to talk about the generation thing.
a difficult question that comes in: are they then overskilled or too niche skilled? How do you? What happens to somebody who moves, becomes part of the brain drain, but becomes a specialist in a developed country, and no longer fits within the society they grew up in because they're too specialized, or
Yeah, that
the job opportunity doesn't even exist in that country.
for sure. There's that specialization gap that you'll get, and I definitely get that they're gonna be too, high skilled, and that's something they'll have to either compensate. They either work remotely for the other country and then do something part time here just to contribute back. That could also be an opportunity to initiate a new industry, to encourage entrepreneurship, that they start or pioneer that niche industry that they specialized in. But that's going to be very difficult. So then you'll have need of certain policies to stimulate that. That's one way to approach it. But you'll always have that situation with the gap, because that's the reason they left in the first place, because they wanted to further their career, further their education. And if they come back, no one's going to be able to pay them a small amount of group. So that's opportunity to develop in new industries. So that's the ebb and flow of it, I'd say.
But then getting back to policy, what would be good policies to have a constant ebb and flow of brain drain and brain gain?
I think the most important thing is a stable economy, a predictable economy. It doesn't matter what the exchange rate is, it should just be predictable.
But
and
if I
that's when
say that it's predictable because the inflation is predictable as well, is that
the-
is
how can you predict that? So it should be stable because
predictable in the sense that we have a
oh,
constant
we're gonna keep
inflation?
rising. We're gonna
Yeah.
keep rising. That's a tough one. I don't think anyone would want to be there because then you won't have anyone to able to pay you. You charge me X amount today, I charge you 10 times tomorrow because of inflation. That just doesn't work. So in the local currency, so in what monetary system are you gonna work? And not to divert too much into that because I have a book right in front of me and we're not gonna talk about that. But but yeah, so a stable economy with kind of those policies would be important. I think that's the most important thing, and then to stimulate the production and the specialized workers skills. That's always going to be a challenge. If you can do it remotely, those have an advantage. They can do the work remotely and contribute to the economy back here. So that's a small win that we should celebrate and take. But the other gap, that's just gonna be something that everyone will need to work on. And remind me again what you mentioned about the generation stuff, because I did have a comment on it, but we,
Yeah,
we
I
we
was
diverted
wondering
from that.
I was wondering in the sense if our generation looks differently at migrating back than the generations that experienced the 80s and the revolution and everything as teenagers.
So I look at it a bit differently on how the generations work or are supposed to contribute. If you look at how the generations across a developing country versus a more advanced economy work, because you have a lot of established social system, so they have less children. Basically, the birth rate of a lot of advanced economies is between 1 or 2, and it's declining slowly over the years because they have the social systems, and that's why they want migrant workers, because they need actual skills to run the economy. Whereas the less developed countries, they have more children because that's seen as workforce. It's basically they have the children are basically there to take care of them when they turn elderly.
Yes.
So it's a
Yes.
different outlook
It's assets. It's almost like their assets.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's maybe not a nice way to say it, but that's how they do look at it. If you look at the basic economies on farming, on agriculture, uh, in the past, it's basic. They had a lot of children just to help run that more efficiently. If you look at China, pre-birth policies, that's what you had. India, that's a prime example of that. They are now maybe the bigger cities, the major cities, are moving towards a more focused surface-based economy, but there's still a huge divide in India. So that's the thing about the generations. So if you're comparing generations, it would have to be within one location. If you compare the generations of
Yeah.
one location versus comparing the generations in different
But you
locations.
mentioned something else that's pretty interesting. And that's whether or not there's a correlation between brain drain and more poverty in a country. As in, if the
Elaborate.
brain, well, there are like a lot of countries that are highly successful or considered developed and successful countries, which struggle with the same poverty gap
Something like
that
Venezuela or
developing countries
yeah.
that developing countries often experience. It's just that it's a difference between the center and the periphery.
Yeah, if you bring
So
that
in
to
in the
to the
economic
well,
center,
yeah.
it's like you're on a high. international global level. But then when you enter the periphery, it's like, oh wow, it's the same. It's the same then in the poorer countries. And that's the discussion that was being made. And that's where I feel to go for Silco for me is the media plays a very important role because we always experience like, hey, it's a brain
I'm
drain,
still here.
and the brain drain is yeah, and the brain drain is in a developing country moving to developing countries. But there, even in developed countries, in Western countries, there's also a brain drain from the periphery to the center. That people go, more and more people go work in big cities where the bigger
Yeah,
economies are,
it's. I think
and
Europe is a
that's a
prime
brain drain
example
as
of that.
well.
Yeah, Europe is a
Yeah,
prime example of that since the establishment of the European Union. If you look at Switzerland, Switzerland is basically the financial capital in Europe, and some skilled workers in other industries, they live in Germany, but they move to Switzerland to work. And that's kind of the center, right? The economic center. So people move there, and the periphery around that, if you look at it from a European Union perspective, Spain, Greece, the outskirts, and the more northern and eastern side is kind of
they're
getting less.
complete. There are complete Italian cities that have been abandoned for maybe 20 to 40% of the buildings.
Yeah,
Like
and like the famous touristy spots too.
there are like cities in Italy where you can buy a house for practically $100, just as long as you come and live there and renovate the house, because otherwise it will go completely to waste.
So I think the correlation, if we're talking about the correlation and poverty, the correlation is skilled workers go to the economic centers
Yeah,
because to either improve their financial situation, their living standards, or their career opportunities. And the periphery, as you mentioned, the outskirts kind of get left behind. And that's the same thing if you're looking at it from a more decentralized, fragmented global scale with developed nations versus developing nations.
but is becoming part of that economic center, should that be the goal or not?
The goal for who?
No, but if you
I
want
it
to
makes
battle brain
sense for
drain, right?
people. Yeah, but we need to define if we're talking about a goal for who, because if we're looking at it on an individual level, on a nationwide level, so that bit becomes a challenge.
But
On a
because
nation level, you want to become a more advanced economy, but how do you do that? You need to attract brain power to your country, and that's the battle, right? What
so
opportunities can you
this
give?
is where I find it difficult, because for me there's a major difference between brain power and skilled work.
Yeah, I,
Yeah,
brain power and skilled work is basically higher educated individuals. I put them in the same baskets. You can differentiate to the type of work, but basically you need more advanced individuals that can add more value. It's
but is
basically
it
value
actually
adding.
higher skilled workers or the ones seeking more for economic or financial gain?
I think there's a correlation there. The,
There is a correlation, but it's not one,
yeah, it's
like a
not going to be
complete
one to one,
match. Yeah.
but I do think there's a correlation there. I see a comment coming in. Braindrain can give opportunities to other people to
Yeah,
rise up the ranks. Yeah,
I completely
that's
would
a
agree with
comment
that. Yeah.
that Jean-Luc mentioned earlier in the
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So I think that's a very interesting to look at. And my major concern comes with these centers of economy, that what happens when economy becomes so big that it isn't actually the skilled workers that
People are starting to move
that
out.
flock towards, yeah, that flocks toward it,
The
but actually people who want to just earn more.
Yeah,
And there's
but the
becomes
people
a
who have
disconnect between high earning employees and actual skilled labor.
Exactly, Michael. The country must attract knowledge and skills to help move the country forward. So that's what to my point, that's what I meant with, you need something to attract people. Like some of the countries are using their universities to attract people.
Yes.
And that's a way because they have that reputation of having good worldwide universities. And to get to that point is also a trajectory that you need to do. So we need something that separates us, basically looking at a country as a unique, as a business, a unique selling point that attracts people here, that wants people to apply. And to your point on the periphery or centers of uh, economic centers, people moving there, the people already established there are actually moving out because it's
Yeah.
getting too crowded, it's getting too competitive, it's getting too expensive for them. So they slowly move out of the center and go into the periphery. And I think that's the same phenomenon that's happened when I said, there's a phase, right? The people that go here to the Netherlands after a few years or decades, they come back. So there's the ebb and flow of that, I think.
So the
But
question is, are you being sold a lie?
by who?
By your, are you selling yourself a lie?
I'm not selling myself anything. I'm
No,
here.
you're not. You're not. But
Such
when
a-
you omit to the brain drain, when you decide to say like, "Hey, I'm actually taking my talents outside of my current country."
I think that's the difference, right? How do you view it? Are you viewing it from a pride nationalistic point of view, or are you viewing it more from a individualistic survival,
Nobody,
familiar point of
nobody
view?
does it from a pride, nationalistic view solely. Like there's other factors involved. So I would never say that it would solely be because you
Right.
love your nation that you do something.
So I think that's your answer.
Yeah.
If you're selling yourself a lie or not, it's purely on survival, getting a better life for you, your family, your generations.
For me, it depends from person to person. Like Michael says, it depends on where you can thrive as an individual. And for me personally, this relates back to a question that I ask young people all the time. And that is, would you rather be a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond?
The famous question, and think about that. There is no right or wrong answer if you're
No,
thinking, but
definitely
you
no.
need to make the conscious decision. And I think that's important. Having that optionality to do that is important. And that's where brain drain, the geopolitical situation plays a huge role, and what advantages does it have for you or not. And then you can outweigh, well, do I stay or do I go, do I further my career and come back later. And there's have been people who've gone and come, there's been people who've gone and gone further, but it's all for living a better life. So I think we're closing the end. And I would say, is brain drain real? That's a question you should answer for yourself. But it's definitely a phenomenon.
With that, we're gonna definitely close this episode off. Diego, we still have to do some plugs. So if you made it all
Oh
the way
yeah, I
to
forgot
the
the
end of this
intro again.
episode,
You did not call me out.
no, 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 I'm not gonna call you out. But if you that are listening or watching the rerun of this episode made it all the way to the end, we want to thank you for being a loyal listener of Social Confoes. And don't forget to subscribe to Diego Amarali's YouTube page or to follow us on Instagram, on IG, which is Confoes. Our username is Confoes. Diego will pop it up in a moment on the screen. And last but not least, all episodes by the end of the month will be released on all streaming platforms. So you can go to your favorite streaming platform, whether it's Spotify, Deezer, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, or something else, feel free to check them out. And we'll see you back next week, same place, same time. This was Social Confoes.
Beautiful.
Bye bye.
See ya.